So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so today we'll be thinking about Black queerness to time and space, so prompted by a discussion of some examples of literary and visual culture that reimagine our world from a Black and queer perspective. This is intended to encourage you folks to think critically about disruption, perception, and representation as they connect to temporalities, bodies, and spaces. And I'll be using Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer Emotion picture from 2018 as a point of origin. So just to note as well, there is one slide that depicts a lynching ritual, but I'll give a further note before I show it. And I've also obscured the kind of sort of violent specifics of that image. And also just a note on the pronouns I'll be using in this. So Janelle Monáe has recently said, and I quote, "My pronouns are free ass motherfucker and they, them, her, she." End quote. And so just for the ease of you folks to follow my discussion today, I'll alternate between they and she pronouns. Okay, so the voiceover at the start of Dirty Computer Emotion picture begins, "People began vanishing and the cleaning began. You were dirty if you looked different. You were dirty if you refused to live the way they dictated. You were dirty if you showed any form of opposition at all. And if you were dirty, it was only a matter of time." This resonates with the history of eugenics and calls to mind various examples of racial cleansing in both American and global history. I also think this is quite a useful point of origin as well, because it resonates with Mary Douglas's point about dirt being matter out of place. And so here I'm thinking about the Black queer body as kind of all being seen as always out of place and thus is always dirty. So this cleaning that Monáe refers to takes place at an institution called House of the New Dawn. So here we have kind of already a possibility of renewal, a kind of engagement with temporality. So the House of the New Dawn is a space which is not only visually marked by whiteness in the overwhelming and stark tonality of the space, but it's also marked by visual signifiers of surveillance, which again are evocative of the New Genesis project, which surveys the somatic terrain of populations with the ostensible intention of strengthening the nation state. So Monáe situates this narrative of surveillance, control, and resistance of the body firmly within the realm of Black queer identity, not in an exclusionary sense, but simply by centralizing this particular embodied experience. Here we have an example of the visual play with whiteness as a signifier. Note that although Jane 57821, so this is Monáe's character, is clothed in white, but her clothing is fairly minimalist, especially compared to later in the emotion picture when her body is fully encased in white clothing. And thus at this moment, her Black body is literally resisting the encroachment of whiteness. The worker who we see on the left of the image here of House of the New Dawn is about to place this white helmet upon Jane 57821's head, exemplifying the intentions of House of the New Dawn to use whiteness to contain Blackness. The fact that this will not only encase her head as a means of control, but it would also contain the hair is, I think, a nod to the historical white supremacist diminution of Afro hair as a need of control and beautification. So Jane 57821 is required to go through the cleaning process, which is also called purification, called Nevermind. So here we have the kind of distraction of hegemonic control, but this also plays on the history of Blackness being always body and never intellect. So always body, never mind. It is also important here, I think, that not only are the two New Dawn employees who initiate the Nevermind process, that they're two white men, but they are consistently signified by their gaze and their manipulation of technology to quote unquote correct the Black body, thus exemplifying the systemic gaze and control of white patriarchy, particularly as it is experienced by the Black queer femme subject. So Sarah Ahmed, in The Cultural Politics of Emotion, notes that, and I quote, "We can consider the sanitized space as a comfort zone. Normativity is comfortable for those who can inhabit it," end quote. Ahmed's thoughts are particularly pertinent here. The sanitization is literalized by the Nevermind cleaning process, and the erasure of the queerness of the Black subject exemplifies the work of the normative, whether heteronormative or homonormative nation state, which takes as its goal the assimilation of the quote unquote deviant subject. in this case exemplified by queerness and blackness, with the accompanying strategy of destruction of the deviant or non-normative body, as we can see through the state and state-sanctioned violence visited upon queer Black bodies, which of course mark much of our urgent discursive activism in our current moment. So this forced normativity that takes place in House of the New Dawn is visually signified by white smoke. And I think that this is a very deliberate choice as it situates normativity as being inextricably connected to whiteness. Here we see the Nevermind process engulfing Jane 57821 in this whiteness, with the consequent result that she incorporates this whiteness and they're literally forced to breathe it in. And here I think that this is a particular kind of evocative image that I think kind of really resonates with this portrait of Toni Morrison by Kara Walker from 2019. And here I'm kind of situating Kara Walker, although she's not kind of queer identifying, I think actually a lot of her sort of artistic practice can be read as queer in her kind of engagement with kind of normativity and sort of rupture. So this sense of kind of thinking about sort of the Black body as a site of kind of incorporation, where we're thinking about the rupture of bodily boundaries, here we see in this portrait of Toni Morrison, but also in this image on the right of Sylvester from the cover of Do You Want to Funk? And here I think that there's something kind of really kind of wonderful about the kind of campness of the kind of cigarette smoke that again gestures towards this sort of porosity of the kind of bodily bound of the Black queer subject. So Alondra Nelson states in Introduction Future Text that, I quote, "Blackness gets constructed as always oppositional to technologically driven chronicles of progress," end quote. Yeah. Monáe uses the computer as a symbol of otherness. Sorry, can I just ask everyone to make sure they're muted, please? So yeah, Monáe uses the computer as a symbol of otherness, where white supremacy has historically cast the Black body as sub or non-human, and only useful in terms of its performance and or output, whether that's physical, sexual, or reproductive labor. So casting the Black body as a dirty computer not only allows us to think about it as being non-human, but also engages with ideas of disease and perfectibility. So again, a kind of callback to eugenics. But also the album reclaims the computer as that which represents the future. So here we have the suturing of Blackness to futurity rather than primitivity, which often happens in the kind of white supremacist imaginary. So Dirty Computer is a clearly Afrofuturist text in its centering of Blackness within a space of futurity, while also interrogating the potentialities that technology represents for Blackness. As Mark Derry notes in Black to the Future, there is an urgency in Black folks being able to envision a future for themselves. Afrofuturism has the potential to recuperate the Black body into a space of protest and agency, where the metaphorical use of the body as technological object is both a response to the historical dehumanization of the Black body and an acknowledgement of the ways in which technology can be harnessed as a political tool to resist white supremacy. So what I mean by this is that Afrofuturism as a genre offers particularly tempting ways to reconfigure technology and machines as positive things and makes sense because Black bodies have historically been conceived of as machines in order to aid white supremacy. So here I'm thinking of this as a kind of particularly kind of interesting form of resistance. So this engagement with technology and its possibilities is threaded throughout Dirty Computer. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far. Here we see one of Jane's memories of being stopped for inspection by a drone, at which point she and her passenger show their electronic identification that is scanned. Although this is explicitly a futuristic scene, this is a tableau that is particularly evocative of the state surveillance that is visited disproportionately upon Black bodies, which is often accompanied by various forms of violence in the present. What's interesting is that Dirty Computer offers the potentialities of technology not only for white supremacist hegemonic power, but also the possibilities that it offers for Black resistance. It is only because of the understanding that Jane and her passenger have of technology and its nefarious uses, as well as the vehicle here as a site of concealment of additional Black femmes, that they succeed in surviving this moment of inspection. This evokes historic Black resistance, here most keenly the Underground Railroad, as well as other moments of evasion of state surveillance and violence, such as navigating and surviving the inspections of immigration and police. So Gregory Hampton, in discussing the racialized history of the machine in American culture, states that, I quote, "In many regards, American slavery was a failed experiment to employ flesh and blood machines as household appliances, farm equipment, sex toys, and various tools of industry without the benefits of human and civil rights." End quote. This allows us to think about the specific resistance that Monáe offers us here, as they envision not only the ways in which being codified as a machine serves white supremacy, but also use it as a strategy of resisting this very ideology. So the next 3 slides demonstrate how Monáe plays around with our conceptions of memory and encourages us to think of temporality itself being a space for queer potentiality. By this, I mean that we in turn look at what the 2 white male employees are seeing when they are looking at Jane's memories through the computer program that they are using to delete her memories. So the first visual iteration we see here is one with the striations of the computer screen playing across the tableau of Jane and her fellow Black femmes in a moment of levity. Although this is marked by the disciplinary technology of New Dawn, which is amplified by the erasure of color in favor of presenting us with this grayscale rendering of this particular memory. So this plays with our sense of linear temporality, as we are both seeing this as a memory, which is being seen anew by the external gaze of these white men. So it's simultaneously an image which is located in the past and in the present. The next image we see is the same event in Jane's past, but we have the reintroduction of color here, alluding to the controlling surveillance of New Dawn being shaken off. Again, we have a further play with temporality, as this is no longer framed as that which is informed by the gaze of the New Dawn's employees, but is rendered in the same way as it would be for Jane when she was actually experiencing this joyful celebratory moment with her community. So it is now simultaneously her present and also her past. So again, I'm kind of interested in this kind of continual rupture of kind of the bounds of temporality. So the next iteration we have again represents an intrusion or interruption to Jane's ownership of this moment. This is again being mediated by technology, as we see through the literal defacement of Jane, right? So where we can kind of see that technology is kind of overtly present because there's a rupture to the image here. We then have a moment that feels like the epitome of Black queer joy, that is marked by reverence, resistance, and reconfiguration of cultural iconography. In this moment, Monáe reimagines the Last Supper as being a moment of Black queer communion and communal strength, with all the participants taking a moment to gaze out towards us, thus also implicating us in this creative moment. So Heather Love, in Feeling Backward, Loss, and the Politics of Queer Emotion, describes queerness as both abject and exalted, a mixture of delicious and freak, and notes that the vital importance of resisting damage and affirming queer existence. So this moment in Dirty Computer exemplifies Love's contention here. Queerness is both exalted and is abject through the emotion picture itself. So Aliyah Abdur-Rahman states that, and I quote, "The Black ecstatic is an aesthetic performance of embrace, the sanctuary of the unuttered and unutterable, and a mode of pleasurable reckoning with everyday ruin in contemporary Black lives under the strain of perpetual chaos and continued diminishment. A post-civil rights expressive practice, the Black ecstatic eschews the heroism of Black pasts and the promise of liberated Black futures in order to register and revere rapturous joy in the broken down present." And again, so we have this kind of sense of rupture, of breaking down, right? So this moment in the emotion picture exemplifies this very Black ecstatic. Monáe is aware of the potential of the past and the future here, but it is in this present moment where, despite the violence surrounding them and their community, that there is a joy taken in what is still possible right now. So with the next frames of the emotion picture, it becomes clear that what we have seen immediately before this ecstatic moment takes place with the defaced Jane that I showed earlier, is that this visual terrain is captured by an overhead object, which is itself obscured by the bright light emanating from it. So the fact that it's kind of carrying out surveillance precludes it from being able to be sort of discernible to us. So it's kind of, it's avoiding the subject, being subject to the gaze precisely because of its surveillance capacities. So this precipitates the arrival of uniformed agents who violently break up Jane and her group, assisted by a drone which may be the same object that we saw overhead. So again, we have this moment which makes us explicitly confront the utility of technology for hegemonic control of Black queer bodies. And this control is played out in the next slide, where we see the accompaniment of Jane's memory and the question of whether this should be deleted on the Nevermind screen, with the embodiment of queer Black resistance. Where these bodies are resisting, but ultimately are shackled by these presumably agents of the state, this draws our attention to the importance of memorialization within resistance to white supremacy, right? So how we kind of think about memory, how we enact memorialization as a kind of political response and resistance to white supremacy itself. So again, thinking about kind of memory temporality here. Their bodies are also visually marked by the use of technology to support hegemonic domination of queer Black bodies. So we see the digital square over each of their faces to suggest facial recognition technology playing its part, right? So this kind of use of technology as a means of containing kind of Black queerness. And again, the ways in which Monáe thinks about technology as being able to resist this sort of hegemonic control. Monáe then gives us this futuristic restaging of the lynching tableau, but centers the queer Black femme body. What is interesting about this reimagining is that we might conclude that this is different because of the explicit inclusion of technology to make possible this white supremacist ritual, whereas I think this is actually encouraging us to think about this relationship of technology to white supremacy as one which is more of a historical continuum rather than an alteration. And as I mentioned at the start, so the next slide is an image of a lynching, but again, I've obscured some of the more problematic aspects of the image. So with the lynching ritual being one with which we might have more familiarity, technology was an integral part. And so again, this is what I think that Monáe is encouraging us to be aware of, right? That technology has always been kind of employed at the hands of white supremacy. And so this is why I kind of think that Afrofuturism is particularly kind of interesting and exciting as a way of kind of wresting control away from sort of white supremacist domination of technology. So whether the kind of presence of technology in the sort of more traditional lynching tableau that we might be more familiar with, so whether that technology is through the accompaniment of the photographic souvenir, so it's self-reliant upon the technologies of the camera and the reproduction processes of photography itself, or the transportation used by the US Postal Service to disseminate these images across the US, or indeed the printing processes behind the newspaper mediation of such events, which amplified their white terrorist function. Technology in various guises has always been an integral part of white supremacy, and Monáe reveals that here. So the enjoyment of Black suffering as something quotidian and unremarkable is also another way that Monáe draws connections to the white supremacist pleasures of the lynching. There is also a sly nod to the consumption of Black suffering with the play on words of take a bite or take a bite, which continues their symbolic rendering of the Black body as both computer but as that which is consumed. There's another connection of this future possibility with historic use of technology to support white supremacist ideology. Here we have one of the New Dawn men inspecting scans of Jane's body to see if the Nevermind cleaning has been effective in quote unquote purifying or correcting Black queerness. And so I'm thinking of this these sort of scans as being kind of particularly sort of evocative of kind of eugenicist imaging of Black bodies as a means of sort of controlling them. And again, just as a note, I'm going to show some kind of images that were kind of quite dominant in sort of serving the eugenicist cause in the next slide. So this image of the kind of inspection of Jane's body that I showed in the previous slide kind of connects in my mind to these images. So it evokes the eugenicist agenda, which itself was heavily reliant upon technology to support and disseminate its assertions. So in this case, photography. So again, Monáe is giving us a warning here of the historic uses of technology by white supremacy and the fact that this exists as a future possibility. So again, this kind of rupturing of temporality, right? This look to history as a way of kind of understanding the present and the future, but these aren't kind of seen as sort of necessarily sort of discrete or distinct, right? There are kind of connections, there are sort of connective threads drawn throughout. So Jane resists being configured according to the demands of white supremacy, and we see her reconfigured as Django Jane, where she states that she is Jane Bond, never Jane Doe, and I Django, never Sambo. So thus, Jane 57821 is reclaiming historic representation, taking two iconic figures of masculinity, so i.e. Bond or the spy, and Django or the cowboy, and subverting them while also refusing anonymous death. So in the case of John Doe, and in the case of Sambo, the refusal of racist stereotype. So towards the end of the emotion picture, again, we have the assertion of the importance of memory, and thus the past, in constructing a potential futurity in which Black queerness is elevated and celebrated. Within the racist rhetoric of House of the New Dawn, freedom through the achievement of normativity is contingent upon forgetting. And so this is where, this is Zen speaking to Jane 57821, who notes that it's best if you just enjoy the process, accept it. People used to work so hard to be free, but we're lucky here. All we have to do is forget, right? So there's a suggestion that it's in sort of abandoning memory, abandoning memorialization, that one can find happiness. But this is kind of very sort of explicitly framed with a kind of white supremacist futurity. And so here again, I think Monáe is drawing our attention to the importance of how we understand temporality, how we think about memory and memorialization. In fact, remembering it is crucial to the survival of Jane, Zen, and Che's queerness and refusal of white supremacy, as it is through the affective relationship to the intimate history of Jane's tattoo that allows Zen to unshackle themselves from the impacts of Nevermind. And finally, just before we see their triumphant escape from House of the New Dawn, Jane demonstrates that it is her ability to utilize the language and behaviors of this white supremacist space that allows her to outmaneuver it. So here, where she's kind of pretending to kind of still be sort of brainwashed by House of the New Dawn, she's speaking to Che. She says, "Good morning, Che Achibe, patient 06756. I'm Mary Apple 54, and I'm your torch. That means that I'm here to bring you from darkness into the light." And so again, I think there's a kind of ironic sort of play around with sort of particular histories and memorialization. And again, this idea of bringing Che from darkness into the light, right? So this idea that sort of darkness, blackness is inherently bad, right? And so House of the New Dawn perpetuates this kind of this sort of racialized idea. But, you know, obviously in the kind of callback to kind of biblical imagery with kind of Mary and the apple here, I think this is also kind of calling upon kind of different forms of sort of oppression and kind of gendered restriction. So where kind of Jane demonstrates that it's her ability to utilize these languages and behaviors of this white supremacist space, it's this that allows her to outmaneuver it. So this suggests that although technology does have these negative possibilities, one of the ways of marshalling it in the service of Black queer resistance is through developing our knowledge and mastery of it. And so at the end of the emotion picture, we see Jane 57821 escape from the facility where two white men are trying to erase her memories in a space visually marked by whiteness and the processes of violence, surveillance, and experimentation, with the help of their lover Zen and Che. Queer Black solidarity and collective action here permit an escape from white supremacy. So Monáe's Dirty Computer uses Afrofuturism as a tool to disrupt white supremacy. This is not only because of a subjectivity which is fiercely femme, queer, and Black, but also because it delivers an unflinching critique of white supremacy and misogyny and homophobia, which of course are bound up in kind of whiteness in sort of colonialist thinking, while also situating Black queer experiences as being central and heroic. So in kind of continuing my kind of interest in these sort of ruptures that are presented in Dirty Computer, I'm going to move to another text here and just kind of hopefully sort of drawing out some of these kind of connective threads that I see operating across multiple kind of Black queer texts. So this is a poem by Danez Smith, taken from their 2017 collection, Don't Call Us Dead. So the poem, dream where every Black person is standing by the ocean. And we say to her, what have you done with our kin you swallowed? And she says, that was ages ago, you drunk them by now, and we don't understand. And then one woman, skin dark as all of us, walks to the water's lip, shouts Emmett, spits, and surely a boy begins crawling his way to shore. And so again, kind of, I think that this sense of kind of the rupture of bodily boundaries, which I mentioned in relation to Jane 57821, sort of incorporating or being made to incorporate this sort of smoke of whiteness, right? So being made to incorporate whiteness. But also in the image I showed of Kara Walker's image of Toni Morrison, and also in the album cover that I showed at the beginning. So here, again, I think that there's something interesting going on in this sense of kind of bodily bounds being ruptured, right? So where one woman who shouts Emmett and then spits, and then surely a boy begins crawling his way to shore. So again, there's a sense of kind of resistance in this kind of porosity of Black bodies. And this is also kind of pointed to with the kind of the kin that have been swallowed by the ocean. So here we have a kind of sense where the kind of, as I think is evident in Dirty Computer, where the collective replaces the singular. There's a kind of importance of sort of fluidity, whether literally or kind of figuratively, in the kind of capaciousness of the ocean in its swallowing of ancestors, as well as its incorporation by every Black person, right? So that, again, this sense of the collective. And also this sort of rupture of the bounds of the kind of human as well, with the personification of the ocean here being gendered and having a lip. So fluidity here becomes essentialized as Black materiality. And again, this sort of rupture of the kind of past, present, and future, where we have a kind of callback to Emmett Till, and then there's a kind of present moment as a boy begins crawling his way to the shore, and kind of contextualizing this poem within the larger collection. This is kind of at the end of the collection, where there's kind of particular interest in kind of looking forward to kind of the future, right? So again, these sort of temporal ruptures that are going on here. So I think this kind of fluidity that I think is present in the poem that I've just shown you can also be seen in Barry Jenkins' 2016 film Moonlight. And so here, these are some stills from the character of Chiron at different kind of moments in the narrative. And the character of Chiron is actually called different names if you're not familiar, which I'll kind of talk a little bit about in the next slide. But here we see kind of Chiron as a teenager, and then Black as he's known as a kind of older adult here. And there's a kind of fragmentation here, but also a collectivization of the self, right? So there's a mirroring of Chiron kind of immersing his face in the ice bath. So this sense of kind of fragmentation of self, but also the kind of collectivization of various selves that we might kind of possess, we might occupy. And I think this really resonates with this quote by Edouard Glissant. So where he talks about the moment when one consents not to be a single being and attempts to be many beings at the same time. And I think that this, again, really resonates with the Danez Smith poem that I just showed you on the previous slide. So we think about Glisson's words about the refusal of singularity and the explicit claiming of collectivity and multiplicity, so seeing the Black body as uncontained and therefore uncontainable, rather than discrete, challenges the history of racist containment of Black bodies. So for example, enslavement, lynching, or incarceration all rely on the individual Black body being the site of containment and brutalization. So the mixing of bodily boundaries that we see in Smith's poetry, in its contingency upon consensual blurring of bodily boundaries, which is heavily eroticized, also wrests agency away from systems of racialized oppression, which rely upon the violent rupture of consent and destruction of bodily integrity. And so again, so kind of to continue thinking about this sort of sense of fragmentation, so this is an example of one of the intertitles taken from Moonlight. And so we have these intertitles which divide the narrative up into discrete temporalities themselves, yet these are also merged throughout the film. So they're merged by the kind of calling of Chiron when he's using kind of the appellation of little, Chiron, or Black, with different kind of names for him. And also there's a kind of rupture of temporality throughout the film, because we have kind of cross-cutting of particular sort of temporal moments with ones from sort of previous or future chapters. And so again, thinking about kind of fragmentation and the way that Moonlight kind of plays around with this this kind of sense of how the self is fragmented. And so it might be a kind of collection of multiple selves. So these are the three intertitles that we have in the film. So we have 1 little, 2 Chiron, and 3 Black, which I also kind of reading as not only being kind of sort of part 1, part 2, and part 3, but also that there's a particular kind of utility in Jenkins choosing to use the lowercase I here. So we actually have part 1 is I little, part 2 is I Chiron, and part 3 is I Black. So in this diminution or reconfiguring of the self, there is a recognition of what happens to the queer Black subject as a result of racism and homophobia. So there is a shrinking or a reduction of the self. So in the case of Moonlight, with the I, there is also the sense of multiplicity within the self, or an increase. So I becomes I becomes I. So in the use of these iterations of the I, or the self, there is also the possibility of ascribing any sense of self onto this space. There is no specified or defined self or identity. So this is juxtaposed with each of these iterations being coupled with a definitive self through the naming, so little, Chiron, or Black. So the fact that these are all capitalized in contrast to the I's implies a different sense of importance of enunciation being made here, which is made particularly clear through the use of little and Black as names. So rather than basic physical descriptors that would be indicated if they were not capitalized, they therefore must contain more importance or more capacious meaning. Through the use of the period separating the I and the name, there is a sense of interruption or ruptured continuation. So also, as we see the third self iterated, so I Black, there's also a suggestion of a possible intersectional identity. So what I mean by that is the more I's that there are in play, which happens in tandem with Black seemingly becoming more comfortable with the intersections of his queerness and his Blackness, the more there is also the possibility of fragmentation of the self, right? So this sort of simultaneous increase and kind of expansion, but also that allows for a greater possibility of kind of fragmentation or kind of rupture of the selves. So this focus upon the different possible iterations of the self relates back to the examples of the way that white supremacy attempts to fix and contain the meanings that Blackness can contain. So if there is this kind of queer Black possibility, as Jenkins and Smith suggest, this functions as a repudiation of the idea that Blackness can be concretely defined, and instead it spills out in multiple and fluid ways. And again, I'm going to return to Smith's poetry here. And so this is the final 2 pages of a poem that is happens across 4 pages, called Litany with Blood All Over. So here again, we have a sense of a merging of the selves, which is achieved through the mixing of blood in intimate moments. And so just in case you can't see it kind of that well on your screens, because I'm assuming it's probably quite small. So there's a kind of increasing kind of overlap and merging of the words my blood, his blood. And so these become kind of so increasingly merged that this sort of culminates in the kind of the whiteness of the page itself being kind of obliterated, right? So as the blackness of the type of my blood and his blood being laid over in increasing sort of repetition, consistently kind of erodes this whiteness, right? So makes this space literally a kind of black space, also in the kind of mixing of my blood and his blood through the kind of this sort of moment of kind of intimate sexual exchange. Also, I think kind of is erasing whiteness, not just purely through blackness, but specifically through black queerness. So as these cells become collective rather than legibly singular, and again, thinking back to Glisson's words about consenting not to be a single being. So this is also accompanied by the whiteness being obliterated by increasing blackness, and this parallels the image of individual blood cells mixing. So again, the vital importance of fluidity being represented in a range of ways. So here I'm thinking back to the kind of incorporation of the ocean water in the previous poem, but also the kind of fluid exchanges that we see kind of consistently through Moonlight itself. So Jose Esteban Muñoz's discussion of queer futurity, so he says that, and I quote, "We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. The here and now is a prison house," end quote. And so again, I'm kind of interested about kind of how Muñoz understands kind of sort of a queer temporality here, and this sort of, again, this sort of rupture of how we can understand past, present, and future, and how we can kind of connect this up to the kind of ruptures of temporality that we see in the three texts that I've presented here in this talk. And so I'm just going to kind of draw this back to the ending of Moonlight. So here we have a kind of mirroring of Smith's poem of called Dream, where every Black person is standing by the ocean. So this text closes with little, and thus us looking out to the Atlantic, both to the past and to a queer futurity. So this last scene also merges temporalities through the cut from Black to little, as well as centering the Black queer body as the locus of pleasure and possibility. So I'm going to leave it there. I've gone actually slightly under my expected 45 minutes, which is good for me. So hopefully I've kind of made some of my sort of interest in how I think these texts are playing around with temporality, with the body, with spaces, and how these can kind of be ruptured, how we can kind of see a kind of destabilization which happens sort of explicitly when we understand these from a kind of specifically Black queer subject position.